series on the book of Ruth. Who's been enjoying this series? Yeah? Oh, that's good. Well, I will say, if you haven't found yourself saying stRUTH at some point in this series, then I'm not sure you've been paying attention, right? Because we have been following the remarkable story of two widows, Naomi and Ruth. Naomi and Ruth, at the start of our story, are both faced with utter tragedy in losing their husbands. But more than just dealing with grief, they find themselves economically stuffed, right? They find themselves in a really, really difficult position. Probably Naomi more so than Ruth because she's older. And while Naomi allows her tragedy to make her bitter toward God, Ruth uses hers to cling to God even tighter than she had before. And Ruth makes this unbelievable decision to forgo her future prospects, to forget looking out for number one and making the most of the long life that she has ahead of her, all her dreams and all her aspirations. And instead, she commits to doing everything she can to provide and take care of her mother-in-law, Naomi. And we began chapter 2 last week, highlighting that not only does Ruth talk a big game, she has the actions to back it up, right? Chapter 2, we saw how what Ruth displayed was no generic devotion, but it was risk-taking devotion, right? That it was devotion that was prepared to sacrifice. It was prepared to go all in for the sake of the other, for the sake of God's kingdom. One of the things we noted that the author highlights throughout this chapter is that the consequence of this kind of devotion is the favor of God. The consequence of this kind of devotion is the favor of God. And so despite Ruth being a gleaner in this scene, a destitute beggar, despite what's possible from a human perspective, the chapter closes out with Ruth not only getting staff privileges, if you remember, not only getting a gift from Boaz, and a significant gift at that, but she, because of her audacious request to harvest or to glean in the harvested sheaves, she's taken home several weeks worth of food for her and Naomi. And that was the spoils, catch this, just from day one. Right? Day one. And this is the treasure chest she brings home. And then the chapter closes out by saying that she remained in Boaz's fields for the entire duration of the barley and wheat harvest. And this then is where chapter 3 kicks off this morning. Let's start in verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." All right, so some time has passed since Ruth has initially met Boaz. She's been gleaning now on his fields for the duration of the harvest. And so if the spoils from day one are anything to go by, she's most likely made bank, right? It's a modern way of saying she's amassed a heck of a lot. And because of this, because the pressure of her and Naomi's immediate needs has more or less been subsided, Naomi has the freedom now to begin to think longer term. She's not thinking hand to mouth anymore. Ruth's got this storehouse of provision from her favor from Boaz and her gleaning, that Naomi begins now to think about Ruth's future. And so she says to Ruth, "Okay, you've helped me steady the ship. You've brought in enough food and resource now to keep us going for quite some time. Now I need to do what I can to ensure that you're okay long term. I need to find you a husband. And Naomi has obviously been thinking about this, because not only does she have someone in mind, but she has a bit of an elaborate plan to go with it as well. Let's read. She says, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for. Now Boaz," wink wink nudge nudge, "with whose women you have worked, is a kinsman of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor." I love this about Naomi. She gets straight to business. None of these people are like whiffy-waffy, say one thing, mean another thing. Nah, man, straight to the point. And so her first suggestion about eligible husbands must be no shock to Ruth, right? She says, what about Boaz? And this makes sense, right? I mean, not only is he a Gabor Hayil, a worthy man, a virtuous man, but he's shown an unprecedented level of favor and kindness towards Ruth so far. And so I'm sure in Naomi's mind, she's like, what a good place to start. But I want you to look at the word that she uses to describe Boaz. Because after flagging him as a potential, she seems to hint that it's a bonus that he's our modath, which is the Hebrew word for our kinsman or family friend. And this may not seem significant right now, but it is, because toward the end of chapter 2, when Ruth is telling Naomi about her first encounter, her first meeting with Boaz, Naomi tells her that Boaz is their Goel, right? Which is the Hebrew word for kinsman redeemer. And a kinsman redeemer had a very particular role and function in Israelite society, which we'll look at in a sec. But for the moment, I just want you to note here that Naomi is suggesting that Boaz could be her husband, not the kinsman redeemer. And we'll walk through why that distinction is important. Alright, so Naomi lays out her plan now in verse 3. She says, wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes, then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. Alright, the first thing I want to mention about Naomi's plan is that it's far more practical. Everyone say practical. It's far more practical than it is sexual. Alright? Often as modern hearers, we read things like put on your best clothes or put on perfume or uncover his feet as very sexually charged things. Like she was telling Ruth more or less to put on her best heels, to get scantily dressed, and then to go down there and bust out her best sensual moves. This is not the case. Naomi is simply showing a high degree of practical wisdom. That is, hey, you want this to go well? You want this to go well, Ruth? Make sure you've had a bath and smell nice. Hey, you want this to go well? Take off the clothes that you've been wearing to signify that you're a widow in mourning and put on some really nice clothes. Hey, you want this to go well? And this one definitely shows that Naomi's learned a thing or two about men in marriage. She says, wait for goodness sake until he's finished eating. And all the women say, yeah, we know that. You see, Naomi is not coaching promiscuity here. She's preaching prudence. Even a comment about uncovering his feet, scholars suggest, rather than being some sensual gesture, It was actually just a clever ploy on Naomi's part. Essentially, Naomi was saying this: once he's asleep, sneak up and uncover his feet and lay down, and as the night air gets cool, he'll wake up because he's got cold feet. It's literally what she's thinking. He'll then suddenly see you, realize you're not there to talk politics or climate change, and then you can await for his instruction. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to mention about Naomi's plan is this. You ready? It is incredibly risky. Man, you think Bitcoin's risky? This plan is next level. In fact, many scholars argue, given the context and society, that this plan was so risky that it was borderline dumb. You see, the threshing floor was where Boaz would be winnowing barley, right? But the threshing floor was a dangerous place for a single woman, let alone a single foreign woman. It was a big public space where predominantly male farmers would come to sort out the spoils of the harvest. And so not only was there an overload of testosterone, there was lots of drinking, lots of partying, and lots of general revelry at the threshing floor. And so suggesting Ruth go there late at night to find a husband, probably not the smartest thing, right? I was thinking, and I'm glad you're here, Em, it's kind of like, imagine Adam and Ladine saying to Em, oh, you wouldn't mind a husband one day. Hey, I know that massive gathering of tradies, they're having their Christmas breakup party at Dr. Mauve's. Why don't you go down there tonight and, see if you can find a husband? Like, think about this. This is a sexually Adam's like, she would never do that. And that's exactly the point, right? This plan is crazy. She's sending innocent Ruth into an environment that is not conducive to finding a husband, right? And not only that, but all of this secrecy and surprising Boaz in the middle of the night with this vulnerable and intimate gesture, like this could go horribly wrong. I mean, what if someone sees her wandering around at the threshing floor near midnight and misunderstands what she's up to? Because let's face it, it looks dodgy. What if they then ruin her reputation? I mean, she's already skating on thin ethnic ice, right? As a foreigner. What if Boaz sees her and calls attention to her? Hey! Look at this Moabite woman. Man, I don't know what she's doing. She came in here. She's trying to get freaky with me. Like, get her out. This is dangerous. What if she sees, what if he sees her and just straight up decides to violate her? He's a Gabor Ha'il, remember? He's a worthy man. What chance is a single foreigner, outcast woman going to have against the testimony of a Gabor Ha'il, a worthy, virtuous man in the town? Or what about if, and this is probably more likely, what if he says in the moment, sure, I'll marry you. Gratifies himself, but in the morning has a change of heart. I mean, King David, a man after God's own heart, caved in when a similar opportunistic occasion presented itself with Bathsheba. And so we've got to look at this plan and go, man, this is crazy. In fact, the only thing more crazy than this plan is that when Ruth hears it, undoubtedly understanding all of the risks associated and ramifications, that she says, what in verse 5? I will do everything you say. No questions, no comments, no, hey, can we go with, this little bit more looser fitting one? Or can I bring find my iPhone, can you track me, make sure it all, This is crazy. Again, she showcases her risk-taking devotion to Naomi. And the author is about to uncover for us what's driving this unbelievable, almost unsensible Hesed love. This loyal, loving devotion that Ruth continues to display. Verse 5. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, the man shivered, feet, ploy worked, rolled over, and lo and behold, there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer of our family. Now, if you were paying really close attention, and touche if you weren't, but if you were paying really close attention, you may have noticed something significant about this passage. Did anyone, 10 stars if you did anyone pick up on the great inconsistency that the author highlights in this passage? Anyone pick up on the great inconsistency? Put you out of your misery. What were the instructions that Ruth was supposed to follow? Bathe, look nice, smell nice, wait till he's finished eating and dinner, sneak over once he's asleep, uncover his feet, lay down, then what? Then he will tell you what to do. Then he will give you instructions, right? What does Ruth do? She doesn't follow the script. Having perfectly executed every step, when he finds her at his feet, rather than waiting for his instructions, Ruth goes Slim Shady on him, freestyles a bit, and gives him her own instructions. She says, spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're a kinsman redeemer of our family. Which is simply ancient vernacular for this. Will you marry me? However, there is a slight twist here that has a massive impact. Remember at the start of the scene how Naomi said, hey, what do you think of Mr. Boaz? He's our kinsman. He's our Modath, our family friend. Well, Ruth says, marry me, Mr. Boaz, not because you're our family friend, not because you're our Modath, but because you're our Goel. You're our kinsman redeemer. And this is huge. You see, in the law that God gave Moses for the children of Israel, it was clearly stipulated that if someone fell into poverty and was forced to sell their land, or if a husband died and had no sons to inherit his land, then it was the duty of the immediate male relatives to act as a kinsman redeemer, to buy back the land on behalf of the poverty-stricken family, or to marry the widow of the dead husband and bear a son who could carry on the family name and keep the family's inheritance in the family. Right? So the kinsman redeemer was basically God's provision to ensure that the promised land, or that the land God provided Israel as part of his covenant with them, stayed with his covenant people. That it didn't fall into the hands of foreigners, and that none of Israel's family lineages ever became extinct. And so while fulfilling the role of kinsman redeemer was an honorable thing to do before God and before your fellow Israelites, I want to point something out. There was no personal gain for the kinsman redeemer. Okay? You see, the kinsman redeemer not only used their hard-earned money, their own money, to buy back the property for the widow, but they kind of acted like a bit of a donor surrogate, where the son born to the widow and the kinsman redeemer actually became an heir of the deceased husband instead of being the son of the biological father. And so not only did a kinsman redeemer incur the cost of buying the land back, but they then provided a son for the deceased husband who could inherit that land. Lose-lose, right? But this is where things get cool. You see, Ruth realizes that Naomi can't bear a child for herself. And so despite the fact that she is free, she is literally free because she's not a male relative. She's a female daughter-in-law. So she is free to marry whoever she wants. She's free to marry Boaz simply as a modaf, as a family friend. However, she instead says, marry me, but do so as our Goel. And the reason that this is a big deal is because instead of marrying Boaz and hopefully having a son of her own, she is saying, marry me as Goel, and I will provide a son, not for myself, but for Naomi to carry on her family name and lineage. Can you think about that? I was hoping my kid wouldn't have left. Because imagine Zeph, right? And imagine Bianca just going, no worries. I won't have this son. I'm going to give up the opportunity of having this son so Naomi, so my mother-in-law, can have a son and an heir instead. This is a big deal. And this is why Boaz responds the way he does in verse 10. Let's read. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger man, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my life when I've read this, I often kind of read this passage thinking that this was some old man being grateful that Ruth had shown kindness by offering to marry him instead of some young, eligible, handsome Palestinian. This is not what's happening. The kindness he's referring to is Ruth's choice to forgo her personal entitlement. Love that word, right? Her personal entitlement of marrying someone that she wanted to and becoming the mother of her own child. She's willing to forgo that and instead marry someone who could fulfill the role of kinsman redeemer and provide a child and an heir to her mother-in-law, Naomi. I don't know about you, but I was thinking about this week. If I was in Ruth's situation, I reckon I'd have a few, thoughts running through my brain that wanted me to act slightly different, right? I can't imagine. I think I'd be thinking things like, hang on, I lost my husband too, right? You're not the only one that lost your husband. I lost my husband. And hey, haven't I already done a lot for you? And hey, I don't see Orpah here risking her life and sacrificing her future for you. And look, I have set you up now with plenty of grain and resources to go on pretty much forever. Surely, I can look after number one at least just this once and pick the husband I want and have my own child without having to give him away. And yet Ruth, having already done so much for Naomi, still puts Naomi's needs ahead of her own. Like, talk about real sacrificial love, right? Not this 21st century sort that professes to live with this kind of uncomfortable and sacrificial devotion toward God. So long as I'm not uncomfortable, then I don't have to sacrifice. And understandably, this blows Boaz away. And the end of this verse for me is the key thread of this entire chapter. You see, Ruth has displayed this unbelievable risk-taking devotion to Naomi and inference to Yahweh. And if the author's done his job well, then by this point, having witnessed Ruth's self-sacrifice and her loving devotion time and time again, now reach a climax in this epic display of selfless sacrificial love, we must find ourselves asking, why? Does anyone sit there and wonder, why are you doing this, Ruth? No one can be that kind. No one can be that selfless. What on earth are you playing at? What's your motivation? And I think the author cleverly answers this question in Boaz's response. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich nor poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. And here's why. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. All right, Boaz does something very significant here that I want you to catch. He basically says that all of this baffling devotion and sacrificial love is because she is what the Hebrew calls an Eshet Hayil. Now, Eshet Hayil in Hebrew literally means Eshet, woman or wife, Hayil, of noble character. Now, remember we said a couple of weeks ago that to understand the Bible well, we have to interpret each puzzle piece in light of the others, right? Well, where in the Bible have you heard this phrase, woman or wife of noble character? Proverbs 31 wife. Bingo. What's the Proverbs 31 wife? It's an acrostic poem that closes out the book of Proverbs, where each verse starts with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet to describe this Eshet Hayil, to describe this woman or this wife of noble character. And this is where it gets cool. You see, unlike our English Bible, that for chronological reasons places Ruth after Judges, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. The original Hebrew Bible, catch this, the original Hebrew Bible placed Ruth directly after Proverbs. Let that sink in. And so the very last thing that you read when you're reading the Hebrew Bible, as you begin the book of Ruth, in its original arrangement, is this monologue about the Eshet Hayil. And so as we read the book of Ruth, we begin to realize, oh my gosh, Ruth is that very Eshet Hayil, right? Proverbs 31. A wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth more than rubies. Her husband or her mother-in-law has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. Anyone coming to mind? She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships, bringing her food from afar. She gets up early in the morning or while it's still night. Anyone ringing a bell here? She gets up early in the morning. She provides food for her family. Anyone ringing a bell here? What has Ruth just brought in all of this provision and food through Boaz for her mother-in-law? She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable and her lamp does not go out at night. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. What is Naomi? Needy. What's Ruth doing? Are you seeing the correlation here? When it snows, or when famine and death strike, she has no fear for her household. She's audacious. She's risk-taking. She's clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. If anything jumps out to you about Ruth, what has it been thus far? That she's a hard worker, right? That she's not idle. And so as you go through this passage in Proverbs, which ends the book of Proverbs, right before Ruth starts, you get this monologue that when you start hearing about Ruth, you can't help but go, hang on. Like, are these two like whoa, hello? And just in case, I love this about the Bible, just in case you're asleep or your comprehension skills are even worse than mine, and somehow you miss the correlation that the author wants you to catch between the Eshet Hayel and Ruth, Boaz flat out points it out in verse 11 and says, all of this kindness, all of this devotion, this makes sense because you are an Eshet Hayel. And everyone in our town knows it. And here's the significance. You see, while we're sitting there, scratching our head thinking, come on, as if, Ruth, you can't be this nice. Like, what's your secret? The author hopes that this implied question is answered from the overtones of what we've literally just heard coming out of the book of Proverbs. Because what is the secret sauce for the woman of noble character, of the wife of noble character? Let me read it for you. Proverbs, after the author has gone through how this woman conducts herself and all of her amazing attributes, he sums it up and he says what it comes down to, what it all boils down to, why she's like this. Verse 29. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Now he tells us exactly what makes an Eshet Hayel rarer than rubies. Verse 30. Charm is deceptive. All right? Charm is deceptive. I.e., you may have a killer personality, but that's not the ticket. Then he says, and beauty is fleeting. That is, staying fit and looking good in yoga pants is good, but again, that's not the answer. He says, you want to know what the answer is? Verse 30. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Remember, the author isn't putting Ruth on a pedestal as someone out of reach to us. He's saying, hey, this teenage Moabite girl can be used mightily by Yahweh, so can you. The only thing you need, the only thing that underpins all of that is the fear of the Lord. Now, remember, fearing the Lord isn't about being afraid of Him. Scholar Bruce Watke says, the fear of the Lord refers to a reverential awe and respect for God, and I love this, wait for it, expressed through obedience to His commands, trust in His goodness, and humble submission to his authority. And so in many ways, this is what the author is showing us in chapter 3 of the book of Ruth. You want to be a Ruth? You want to see the kind of provision, the kind of blessing, the kind of miraculous that defines Ruth's life? You want to see that kind of stuff define your life? You want to be used by God mightily and powerfully? You want to hear that, well done, good and faithful servant? Are you done with living for man's approval, suckling on the milk of success or money or holidays or Instagram likes? Well, here's your ticket. Obey his commands, trust his goodness, and submit to his authority. And I want to go out on a limb this morning and make a very bold statement. The only reason you won't see the victory and authority of Jesus in your life, the victory and authority he's already purchased on the cross for you, is one of two reasons. A, because you tap out too soon. You don't do a charis and hang in there for decades if need be. In the fire, it gets a bit tough. You think, man, this persevering stuff, I've had enough. And you tap out and you say, I'm done, I quit. That's reason A. Or reason B, if your heart isn't governed by the fear of the Lord. That is, if you don't obey his commands, trust his goodness, or submit to his authority. You know, the Apostle John writes in 1 John 5 verse 4, for everyone born of God is victorious and overcomes the world. Notice this is not a question. Notice this is not a suggestion or positive thinking. This is a promise, right? This is a statement. For anyone born of God is victorious and overcomes the world. Fact. And here's how. And this is the victory that has conquered and overcome the world. Our continuing, persistent faith in Jesus. Friends, it is one thing to turn to Yahweh when tragedy strikes. And it's one thing to live with risk-taking devotion to his kingdom and will. It's one thing to respond. I want you to hear this. It's one thing to respond when tragedy strikes. It's one thing to respond to God well. It's another thing to go, yeah, okay, I'm going to let my devotion to God be risk-taking and audacious. But if we don't live with the fear of the Lord, if we pick and choose when and how we want to obey God, based on our convenience and our comfort, if we know about his goodness, but we don't trust in it, and if ultimately we don't submit to his authority, because, hey, I quite like the plans I've got for my life, thanks all the same, God, then this is the reality. We will not overcome the world and walk in the victory that has been purchased for us. Friends, I want you to catch this morning. Ruth is not a spiritual idol. She's a spiritual role model. And the thing Ruth grounded her entire life on, every plan, every choice, every relationship, was reverential awe and respect for God, expressed through obedience to his commands, trust in his goodness, and humble submission to his authority. question that the author has for us, that God has for us this morning is, it's this simple. It's, will we follow the example of this teenage Moabite outcast girl? Or are we too busy, too tired, too fearful, or too